Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Human Challenge, where we explore all of the human challenges in today's world, the challenges of being human, and how we can challenge ourselves to be more human for the greater good. I'm your host, Vanessa, and today we are joined by Jason Wang, founder, CEO of FreeWorld, a tech nonprofit that trains and places people with criminal histories into the trucking industry. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Hey, Vanessa, thanks for having me.
I'm so grateful you're here. And I know when I reached out to you, I mentioned how I spoke to Kylie, who just did her research publication around labor market discrimination for formerly incarcerated individuals. Great paper. And it was one of the reasons I decided to get in touch with you. I was actually recommended to speak with you because I think your story is amazing. The work you do at Free World is amazing. So I'm so excited that you're here. And I'd really be grateful if you'd share with us and our audience today a little bit about your story and your history and how Free World came to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my life's mission is to accelerate progress in the criminal justice space, to give every person with a criminal history a legitimate second chance in life. And part of that reason is because, like many other people who have been incarcerated previously, my childhood background is filled with poverty, trauma, and abuse. Uh, Both my parents, they were immigrants who came to this country with absolutely nothing, grew up extraordinarily poor, and my father had a pretty bad time. And so, there were some cases where he got so angry that he would chase me around the kitchen with a butcher knife trying to kill me. Um, this led me to being like a kid that felt very alone in life. I also grew up in Iowa where there weren't a whole lot of other kids who looked like me. And so I didn't really have a whole lot of friends out in the community. And so by the age of 10, I had already attempted suicide, several times. I was a runaway kid. Just felt very, very alone in the world. At 11, my parents got divorced, and I flew with my mom and my grandma down to Texas, where my mom wanted to kind of like give me a better shot in life. But by that point, I was so broken as a kid that I ended up finding a new family, and I joined a local gang. And that gang kind of represented the family that I didn't feel like I had at home. And the gang leader was kind of like a father figure to me. And so at the age of 15, I ended up committing a first degree felony, aggravated robbery. Um, and in Texas, they sent me to a maximum security juvenile prison for 12 years. And so that kind of became like my first entrance or touch point with the criminal justice system.
And sorry, how old were you, Jason? Did you say?
I was 15 at the time.
Wow, 12 years. And what was that experience like?
Yeah, so as soon as I went to into the prison that I was going to be calling home for the next couple of years, one of the things I immediately recognized was that I would get on the tier and I would just see a sea of black and brown faces. And as I got to know many of the other kids, who, by the way, this prison system housed about 6,000 kids between the ages of 10 years old and 20 years old. Like we're talking about
Wow.
10-year-old kids in maximum security prisons for things like truancy or graffiti. Like that was a prison system that we had at the time. They didn't really separate kids based on criminal offenses. And so you would have somebody who was in there for truancy there with somebody with a pretty serious offense. And so it was a scary experience when I first went in. But as I got to know many of the other kids, I came to find out that we all came from very similar backgrounds, but poverty being the most common trait that we had in common across all the people that were I was locked up with. But also many of us came from single parent households, grew up in neighborhoods where violence, drugs, and gangs were commonplace. And many of us didn't really have hope or a view of what a future could look like for us. It was pretty common for us to see somebody get released only to come right back into prison, or you would hear that they got released and were trying to kill on the streets. And so for many of us, it's like, why plan for tomorrow? Why even think about tomorrow when today was not even guaranteed? And so going through that prison sentence was already in and of itself pretty difficult because of the challenging environment within the prison. But also about midway through my prison sentence, the media found out that correctional officers were sexually and physically abusing kids under their care. And as they started to investigate this issue more and more and more, they started to learn that there were thousands of cases of abuse that was happening, spanning over decades. It wasn't even just a isolated incident in just one facility. And so an example is that there was a warden who would take this 14-year-old boy outside of the facility over to his home, sexually assault him, and then put him back into the facility. And any time that there were grievances or any reporting done, the leadership of that prison system would essentially scrap all of the materials. And so what happened is that the governor Rick Perry at the time appointed an independent ombudsman to essentially investigate all of these cases of abuse throughout the entire facility. And so he appointed Will Harrell to be that person. Around that same time, my mom and I had a really, really terrible relationship before I was incarcerated. All the times when I was younger, when my father would abuse me, my mom would never stick up for me. And so I always thought that my mom just didn't love me. It turns out that it was because my mom was afraid of my father. And that was the reason. But, as a young, 12, 13, 14-year-old kid, like, you don't understand that.
Yeah.
But I did become to really understand and to feel how powerful a mother's love could be when I was incarcerated. Because my mom would drive 14 hours every single weekend just to come see me in prison for 2 hours. And she used to
Oh,
say that even though you're physically in prison, mentally and emotionally, I'm in prison with you. And so I grew like a very, very strong bond with my mom. She used to send me these huge packets of mail. And previously, I thought it was like from my old gang members or from girls I used to talk to and all that stuff. My mom was actually sending me math homework. And during visitation, she would test me on the math homework, right? And so she really instilled in me this belief that education could be the tool that breaks this cycle of recidivism. And so I started up GED programs and college prep programs as an inmate. And so that positioned me where when the scandal broke out, the facility essentially wanted to show that, yes, while everything was on fire, we still did have kids that were behaving well on the facility. And so they allowed me to leave the facility and testify in front of the Texas State Senate on criminal justice reform efforts. And so the work that I did with Well and a bunch of other advocates created sweeping changes across the entire prison system. And because of that work, I was released early and given a full scholarship um, to the University of Texas at Dallas, where I earned 2 master's degrees. But even with 2 master's degrees, employers wouldn't hire me due to my criminal history. And so that became kind of like the beginning thoughts or inspiration towards a organization that we would end up building in the future called FreeWorld.
wow. Thank you so much for sharing all that. And I just want to take a moment and hold space because I know those are, challenging things to go through again, to relive them again when we talk about them. So I just want to say thank you for trusting me and trusting our audience and with all of this. And then congratulations for a double master's. That's amazing. I have one and I was like, I don't know if I would even consider a second one. So
Yeah, no, like after I got out of prison, I just felt like I was horribly behind. And I just had such an appreciation for education where when I would go over to college and I would see all these kids like slacking off, sitting in the back row playing on their phones and stuff, I was like, I had been locked up in an environment where
yeah.
you would have about 30 kids of all different like grade levels, reading levels, education levels, who would go into a classroom and the teachers would give us crossword puzzles. And that was my education during my entire prison sentence. And so to
Wow.
be in a college, like I just couldn't imagine not taking advantage of the opportunity. I was a kid that would, go to be the first one in class, sit right in the front row in the middle. I took 21 credit hours a semester. I ended up getting 2 master's degrees in 4.5 years. I just sped through because I felt like I had lost so much time that I needed to make it up. And yeah, so I didn't really get the full like college experience, but I was able to catch up.
Yeah. That's amazing. That's really amazing. Really, congratulations for that. Um, Now, when you were, so you'd built some of these programs, and then I feel I remember that you had also participated in some justice reform. Kind of, I think that was what also helped you get out of, or that was why you were released early. Was not just because of these programs, because you were also supporting. I forget if it was in the when you were you supporting the work of the the independent investigation that was happening. I think right was that what was happening?
Yeah, so as part of my work there, we would examine different policies that didn't make any sense, right? So as an
Mm.
example, we examined this policy about isolated confinement, solitary confinement for youth. And so just kind of draw a comparison. If we can go back to 2020 during the pandemic, when everybody was stuck at home, how, nationally there was a mental health crisis and people were going crazy, and, all of these different impacts on children, educational outcomes and growth and all that stuff. Uh, like that was already traumatizing enough. But imagine that there is a entire invisible system of youth incarceration that happens in the United States. Matter of fact, the U.S. incarcerates more youth than any other country on earth. And in these facilities, kids as young as 12 or 13 years old, if they get into a fight or whatever it may be, they could be put into solitary confinement where they're locked down 23 hours a day and given 1 hour of sunlight a day where they go out into a cage and they literally just like stand there and feel the sun. And some of these kids go in there for months, if not up to a year at a time. No physical contact whatsoever, no handshake, fist bump, nothing. And these are 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old kids. And so just imagine the type of trauma that these kids end up leaving the prison system with. And then we wonder to ourselves, well, why do these kids end up getting released and going back into the system? Well, number one, they were probably in a traumatic environment to begin with. But then you put them into a prison system that further traumatizes them. And after release, you expect them to be law-abiding citizens. How does anybody succeed in an environment like that, right? And so that's the challenge that we have with the criminal justice system, where rather than being a rehabilitative system where people are held accountable for the crimes that they commit, but then are given chances to rehabilitate and then come out a better person than when they first went in, we actually have a more punitive system where people go in, they are traumatized, and come out worse than when they first went in to begin with. And by worse, I just want to very clearly define that as further traumatized, not worse as in like a worse human being.
Right, right. And so this was some of the things that you were investigating, or you were supporting the investigators, like you were looking through some of the policies, and were you part of, I guess, changing some of them?
Exactly, yeah. So we did a deep dive on the policy on isolated confinement, and so with Will Harrell, we ended up creating a memo or a policy change proposal that they ended up enacting. That was just one of many different things that we got into together. Another example is we created the Parents' Bill of Rights for the first time, and so this gave parents the right to be able to see and to visit their children and to access their kids in a way that previously they weren't able to. Another example is our entire rehabilitation system. There was a curriculum that was previously used that we would go through, where we'd go through like our criminal offenses, we'd talk about all the traumatic events that happen in our life. And so I was part of a working group that basically provided feedback on the type of rehabilitation curriculum that would speak more, that would really meet like the inmates where they were. And so those are the types of work that we engaged on with advocates and with Will Harrell.
Wow, lots of change making in a very short period of time. You didn't even need two masters.
Well, I mean, this truly became like the inspiration where I started to realize that my lived experience could actually be valuable to the world. And, I was a kid who had pretty low pretty low self-esteem as a kid, but, Will was just a fantastic mentor that took a lot of risks to, give me an opportunity to share my experiences and my thoughts on how we could build a better system. And I will forever be grateful for that opportunity. I was 16 years old at the time and was just hungry to break the cycle. And he was the person who gave me that opportunity.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so, again, congratulations. I think that's just phenomenal. How did all of this end up leading to FreeWorld and what you do now?
Yeah, so after I got out of prison, one of my biggest goals was to never be poor again. I had seen the impact of being poor and how poverty had impacted my family. And so a lot of my professional pursuits were in order to make money. And so over a period of time, I ended up getting into management consulting, and I was making really, really good living. I had learned, I had been released in 2008. and had a mentor that taught me how to invest on the stock market. And if we go back in time, 2008 was a terrible time, for the world because we had gone through just an incredible recession. And so, from a timing perspective, although I didn't really know what to do in terms of investments, it turns out that the best investment was just to begin investing. And so I would be working like 2 or 3 jobs, putting all that money towards investments, using that money to then, purchase investment properties and all that other stuff. But what I realized was that I was feeling really, really unfulfilled. And on the weekends, I would still volunteer my time to go back to the prisons where I used to be locked up at, in order to go speak to the kids, to continue to work with the criminal justice system to figure out ways to be able to support individuals. But I never turned that into a full-time job because I just felt like in the nonprofit space, there's no way that anybody could earn like a decent living in the nonprofit world. I was also an entrepreneur at the time, so I was setting up a bunch of businesses. And so the turning point really came for me during my second company, where we had built this tech company that was starting to scale. We had about 5 people that were working with me on this project, and I started raising angel investment to help take the company over to the next level. And during this entire time, I had quit my job. I had self-funded the entire company, and I was really kind of getting down to crunch time where I was going dead broke. And so we got to a point where an investment looked promising, but as soon as they figured out that I had a criminal history, they totally shut down the entire proposal. And so it was like one of the hardest experiences that I felt after I was released from prison. In terms of like the decision to shut the company down, because for so many years, basically my identity was tied to the company and the company was tied to my identity. And so the failure of the company felt like a failure of myself. But it was at that rock bottom moment that I decided that I would take a chance, and I decided to work in a nonprofit in New York. And that experience filled me with a level of joy that I just never experienced before, where I felt like I was really doing what my calling in life was, even though I was dead broke and making absolutely nothing. It was worth it. And through that experience, I ended up meeting this amazing guy, Matt Mosheri, Jason Green, and Amy Bradberg. They became the founding board of this new nonprofit that we dreamed together called FreeWorld. And they funded the entire thing. This was Matt's original idea to connect people with criminal histories with vocational opportunities in the trucking industry. And he brought me on to lead that effort, and that's where we are today.
That's amazing. And so why was the focus around trucking specifically?
Yeah, so our thesis as an organization was that poverty was the leading indicator for why people touch the criminal justice system and return back to it. And so if poverty is a leading indicator, then what are the different ways that we can impact that? And one of the things that we figured out was that, okay, well, let's get people into the trucking industry. And we chose the trucking industry really for 4 main things. Number one, trucking is one of the most common employers in the United States. It's the most common employer in 29 out of 50 states. And there are over 3 million truck drivers all across the nation. And for many, many years, the trucking industry had faced severe driver shortages where they just didn't have enough drivers to be able to fill all of the demand. And when it comes to trucking, the old saying is that if you bought it, it's most likely that truck brought it, right? So there's just an incredible demand there. And so because of that driver shortage, they were more willing to hire somebody with a criminal record. And we didn't want to go into an industry where our job would be primarily to try to convince companies to do what has turned out to be an amazing opportunity to access a talent pool that is, motivated and eager to be great employees and to prove their worth in the world. In the trucking industry, they were already there. They were already open to that. And so that's number one. The second thing is that to train somebody in the trucking industry, it's pretty cost effective. To send somebody to trucking school costs anywhere between $3,000 to $5,000. And so to get somebody into a career for that low of a cost, it's pretty amazing. The third thing is that training is actually pretty short. We can get somebody their CDLA license within 30 to 60 days. When somebody is initially released from prison, every second counts. And so the fact that this is such a short training period really allows us to have much better outcomes. And then the final thing is that for people coming out of prison, many of them are coming out with lots of debt, or they might have a credit score that is completely ruined. And it's because, once again, people are usually coming from backgrounds of poverty. But the second thing, too, is that when you get arrested, it's not like they give you time to set your finances in order. Usually, if you're arrested, you're sent to prison, and most of your stuff ends up going to collections or whatever it may be. And so when somebody gets out of prison, it's not enough just to get somebody a job. You have to be able to get them into a career that pays a living wage. And in the trucking industry, you can make $60,000 to $120,000 just within the first year alone. And so it just checked off a lot of different boxes for us.
Wow. That's very interesting to hear, for myself, and hearing, just the kind of thought process that went behind it, but just, how you approached this entire solution as well. I think that's really, really incredible. And so you kind of mentioned, you started your own businesses, and I'm curious to hear a little bit about, you talked about your experience with the investor who pulled out at the last minute, after learning about your incarceration history. And so, if we think of that paper that was released about labor market discrimination, according to that research, it's obviously very common for a lot of, when formerly incarcerated individuals are experiencing that, they'll go and start their own businesses. You had started your own businesses, but you were still having that. So, I don't want the question to be like, how common is that? But I'm just curious, like, obviously that's a huge barrier. So how, if I'm an impact investor, how do we support people? But even for yourself, how did you go through? I mean, you ended up going to the nonprofit space, but is that common? What else do people do in these scenarios when they're trying to raise capital? What are some other barriers that we might face as an entrepreneur who has a history of incarceration?
Yeah. Well, so I don't want to like overly generalize, right? But when you come from an impoverished environment, it kind of is a ripe training ground to be an entrepreneur, right? Because when you're in poverty, you've got to figure it out. Because at the end of the day, we all need to eat, and so you
Yeah.
can't just like sit there waiting for food to drop out of the sky. Like you have to go out there and figure it out, right? And even gangs are structured like corporate businesses. Like a gang has a board of directors, and they have a sales strategy, and they have a distribution strategy. And if you're a drug dealer, you have sales skills and all this other stuff, right? And so, I kind of say all this stuff kind of like tongue in cheek, but the truth of the matter is like people need to do what they need to do in order to survive. And so, yes, there are many people who end up leaving the criminal justice system, and with a criminal record, it can make it so difficult to get any type of educational opportunities or job opportunities that many end up starting businesses. Not everybody, but some do. And in our experience, the nonprofit that I worked with in New York was a nonprofit that was basically kind of like Shark Tank for people with criminal histories, where they would bring together an investment community and had a curriculum where they would teach people with criminal histories how to actually start up legal businesses. And so I got to see a lot of people starting a bunch of different businesses. And so in our experience, what we typically saw was that people did the things that they knew. So they would create like lawn care businesses, garbage businesses, food catering businesses, like whatever it may be. And those were types of businesses that they ended up creating. But to your point, from an impact perspective or impact investment perspective, there's just very few places that you can go to for capital. And so many of these businesses were bootstrap businesses that just turned into lifestyle businesses. And yeah, there's just very few opportunities to get the capital that you need to scale it. Matter of fact, during the pandemic, this is crazy to me. If you had a criminal history, you didn't qualify for PPP loans.
Wow.
And it's like if somebody has a established business track record, why would you not grant them capital when the whole world just stopped? Like, how many people had to shutter their businesses because of the criminal record? And is that fair? It's so infuriating that somebody can do their time and pay their debt to society, but essentially wear invisible handcuffs for the rest of their lives. And that's the experience that we typically have to live with.
Wow. From your perspective, you talked a little bit about some of the reform that you did through the policy work, even what you're talking about now, not being able to get certain loans during a time like COVID. What do you think about the system has to change to better support individuals who have, similar stories or upbringings or experiences like yours?
Well, I mean, how much time do we have, right? I mean, there's
Pick
a
your
lot of things
top
that could
one.
change.
Do you think, yeah, do you think
Yeah,
there's like a top one that sort of feeds a lot of them?
yeah. Well, I mean, look, this might sound like pie in the sky, but just imagine if the criminal justice system was incentivized towards how many people they kept out of the system. Like, change the incentives, you start to change the model. As an example, let's take a look at parole. Parole was intended to be a not only a supervision system, but a support system for individuals leaving the prison system, where you would have a parole officer who would lead you toward educational opportunities, job opportunities that could provide you resources in terms of nonprofit organizations or government funding programs that could help support you in getting your basic needs met and in getting, higher education or whatever it may be. But how that system evolved is that it's basically just a straight up supervision system where parole officers are oftentimes so overworked with such huge caseloads, very limited funding, poor technology, that what ends up happening is that this essentially becomes a system where parole officers are looking to check off boxes. And if you don't fit within a certain box, it's much easier to just send you back to jail or send you back to prison than to actually help you. And so when we look at the number of people who end up recidivating and going back into incarceration or being rearrested, it's actually not for committing additional crimes. It's for not checking off every single box on their parole checklist. It's stuff like not paying fines and fees. It's stuff like, you know, showing up to the parole office late. And this is not stuff that I'm making up or exaggerating. These are things that I personally experienced myself. When I was released early from the prison system, I was released and put on adult parole for 9 years. And when I was on adult parole, I had a great experience with one parole officer, but towards the end of my parole, they started changing me to a bunch of different parole officers, right? So my case manager would continuously change. And at the time, I was working in management consulting, which required me to fly from Texas over to Philadelphia or like whatever it may be. Well, in order to fly to another state, you have to get paperwork in advance. And what I found was that the parole officers would continually not fill out the paperwork, not because I was not qualified to be able to travel outside the state. It's because they either couldn't find the paperwork because you had to fax it in, or because they didn't have time to actually fill out the paperwork. And so what ended up happening is that I had to quit my job in management consulting because if I didn't have the paperwork to fly out of the state, then technically I was violating my parole and they could rearrest me and send me back to prison. Like,
Wow.
this is a type of frustrating system that we're dealing with here. And so imagine a parole system where the funding that they received or the performance benchmarks that they were required to hit were how many people successfully transitioned out of parole, how many people who successfully received a job or education or whatever it may be, and creating a system and support and resources to be able to equip these parole officers so that way they could do their jobs well. That would create a massive drop off in the number of people who end up recidivating and going back into the prison system.
I think that resonates a lot. And then I wish it was one of those things that was easier to do than to just say, like I feel like it's one of those things that it's like it just makes sense, but then it's actually so hard to enact just because of the structure of the system, because I feel like that's a line of thinking that can apply to a lot of different, health, same thing, right? If we could totally change the incentivization around like how you're paid for health and healthcare, right? Like that entire model would just shift. But
Exactly.
I think it's definitely a thought or I think it's definitely an intention that I think resonates with myself, and I'm sure a lot of other people. I have two shorter questions for you. And I'm just curious, based on your experience and where you are now and where you are today, what would you tell your younger self at any point in your life?
I think that when I was younger, I would have loved for somebody to tell me that I was good enough.
Mhm.
Um, I suffer from a lot of like self-esteem issues and this feeling and need to feel accepted by others. Um, a lot of that came from the fact that I didn't really have that at home. And so having that reassurance that I'm good enough would have been really, really powerful to hear as a kid. As a young kid.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I have one sort of similar question. What would you tell others who were once in your shoes?
Well, something similar. I think I think that the feeling that I felt at the time was definitely shared by others. Perhaps something else is like this too shall pass.
Mm,
Uh, the good and the give it enough time and it will pass. And so realizing that there's like a much bigger picture than the four walls that we see in front of us, having that perspective can be helpful sometimes.
amazing. Thank you so much for sharing, Jason. Thank you so much for coming on the show. How can we stay in touch with you? How can we follow you?
Absolutely. So if you're interested in learning more about FreeWorld, you can go to our website at freeworld.org. Again, that's freeworld.org, FREEWORLD.org.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason.
All right, thanks, everybody.